Hi, my name's Jim Leap. I'm on the faculty here at the Woods Institute for the Environment. I'm the chair for this session. This is Nick Buckley-Biggs' dissertation defense, in case you came to the wrong room. This is quite a moment in the career of any student, as most of you in the room know very, very well. But today for us, it is also a chance to learn about some really interesting research. A lot of the work we do in climate change and in conservation goes to the question of what can be done on working lands, and Nick has really dug into that question. How do you engage farmers and ranchers and on these kinds of possibilities? So there's a lot to hear over the course of this hour, which means I will be quick. But I want to introduce the committee because Nick has over the last few years been working very closely with this, well, in particular her two lead advisors, Eric Lambin, whose professorship I have to read. Eric Lambin, who's the George and Setsuko Ishiyama Profostio Professor in Earth System Science, also a senior fellow here in Woods. And the second advisor who's on the Zoom. Oh,
Lynn
hi.
Huntsinger. We're lucky.
You came in while I wasn't looking. What? She takes my lines. Okay, it's nice to see you in person. Okay, and then there are two other members of the dissertation reading committee, Gabrielle Wong-Parodi, who is an assistant professor in Earth System Science and a center fellow here at the Woods Institute for the Environment, and Bruce Cain, who is a professor of political science, and a senior fellow in the Woods Institute for the Environment, the Precourt Institute for Energy, and the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy and Research. Right? Yes? And the director and the director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West. So here's how this is going to work. I'm going to turn it over to Eric. He will introduce Nick. Nick will present her research. We'll then have 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions, both from those of you in the room. You can just raise your hand, your real hand. And those online can ask questions in the Q&A box, and I will read those out to Nick so that she can respond. We'll save a few minutes at the end of the hour for her closing remarks. Okay? Let me turn it over to Eric.
Thank you, Jim. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Nick. And Nick joined the E-IPER programs with already 10 years of work experience under her belt. She works for a variety of sectors, consulting, education, NGO. She was campaign director for the Nature Conservancy. And before that, Nick obtained a BA from Harvard University. Along the way, she learned some Mandarin, Russian, Spanish, French, vraiment, oui, français. Okay, well, equipped with all these language skills, she decided to do her research in California, you know, obviously. And she conducted some fascinating work on rangelands from a variety of land use perspective. And she was so enthused about her research topic that she decided to organize her own wedding on a cattle ranch. So that shows a very high level of professionalism. While we're all isolating, Nick just conducted her project at full speed. And at the same time, she was also doing a fellowship on public service for the Haas Center. And Nick completed her PhD in the record time of 3.5 years, which is pretty good. And as you say, you know, Nick is extremely focused and disciplined. So, Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction. It's very kind. And thank you for everyone for being here, for being on Zoom. Folks are here from Nebraska. I'm hopeful that my grandma's on in New York City on Zoom. So I'm just like so touched that everyone's making time for this and taking the day off work so they can participate. The focus of my talk today is engaging agricultural landowners in climate and conservation action. And I thought I could set the stage first. So we're living in the midst of two environmental crises, the 6th great extinction and climate change. An estimated 1 million plant and animal species are today threatened with extinction. And here we often think that's kind of a faraway issue in some tropical forests, but we're actually experiencing this here at home. In the US, since the 1970s, we've lost 53% of our grassland bird species. And a lot of this is driven by loss of habitat. That's actually the largest driver of these biodiversity declines. The other environmental crisis on our hands is climate change. The last decade was the hottest in 100,000 years. As you can see on this chart, we're now at 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that's a 2 million year high. Both these biodiversity declines and climate change are partly a result of our intensification of the way that we use the Earth's surface. This is what academics call land use. For example, in California's Central Valley, as recently as 1850, that region was a complex of wetlands, meadows, lakes, desert, natural habitat. And fast forward to today, and it's been mostly converted to an intensively irrigated agricultural environment. This landscape is one of the most agriculturally productive ones in the world. And so to address these challenges, land use intensification, climate change, biodiversity, the state of California has created some very ambitious environmental goals at the state level. We've committed to conserving 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, what's called the 30 by 30 agenda. Balancing groundwater pumping with recharge. This is the state's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or what we call SGMA. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 1990 levels, and also achieving 100% clean electricity by 2045. None of this will be easy, and a lot of it will depend on action that will take place on working lands. So working lands include both grazed rangelands, so this is where cattle and sheep graze, as well as croplands. And to give you a sense, today, the Earth's surface, we use about 11% of it for crop farming, and another 25 to 30% for grazing livestock. So it's a huge footprint on the planet, and this is why I focus within land use specifically on food production. I focus on privately owned working lands and those that are water constrained. So folks might be familiar with what croplands look like, but often are less familiar with rangelands. As background, rangelands are where our global livestock are grazed. These are thought of as uncultivated ecosystems vegetated by grasses, forbs, and shrubs. Here in the US, they're mostly west of the 95th meridian. It's the more arid part of the country. There's a mix of public and private ownership of rangelands. You can see in California, around the coast and the Central Valley, we have quite a high prevalence of privately owned rangelands, shown in dark brown. Now, altogether, if you look at private rangelands and private cropland, it's actually about a third of our state. So this is a big footprint we're talking about. California altogether is 100 million acres. So a third of that is the landscape I'm looking into. So far I've told you that we have these two environmental crises on our hands. California has created quite ambitious goals to tackle them, and the solutions for addressing these issues require action on working lands, which have a very high rate of private ownership. Given that whole context, I focus on the human dimensions of land use. So to dive into what that means, my interest is in how individuals make decisions about what they do with their properties, particularly in agricultural landscapes, so on their farms, on their ranches. And the reason I look here is because often environmental solutions, they're developed by government agencies, by conservation groups, in corporate boardrooms, and yet they are dependent on these landowners actually implementing some action or participating in some program. And so these individual landowners are at the center of the success of our environmental goals, and yet very little is understood about how these people view the opportunities, the solutions, how it fits in with their operations, the potential benefits and the potential risks. So these are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in. And for that reason, I center the voices of farmers and ranchers in my research. The way I do that is through interview-based research. It's the social sciences approach based on in-depth, semi-structured interviews, both in person and during COVID by phone. I don't use surveys for two specific reasons in this research. The first is that there's been quite a bit of survey research on this topic, and these studies tend to conclude that participation in a program or adoption of a sustainability practice is statistically correlated with certain characteristics, like the characteristics of an operation or of the landowner. And yet they also conclude that additional qualitative research is needed to understand why those things are correlated and to get at more of the nuance in the trends that are happening. And it's those why kind of questions that I'm interested in that really require qualitative research. And as my colleague Kika Santana wrote in this recent piece, qualitative studies provide insight into the lived experiences of individuals and their communities. This approach I wanted to emphasize is hypothesis generating. It's not hypothesis testing. This is exploratory research. It's important for generating new theory, for identifying potential relationships, and it can form the basis of future large N statistical type research. There are limitations to this approach. First, I cannot claim that my findings represent farmers and ranchers. My samples aren't representative of those populations. Instead, they represent the views of the people I interviewed, the communities that I focused on, the context that they were in. And so they can reveal how certain policies or solutions would fit within those specific contexts and those communities. And then they can also form the basis or foundation for future research that tests more of those relationships. Now, I use a maybe non-traditional creative approach to recruiting my interview samples. Instead of snowball sampling, where people introduce you to the next person to interview, I use as many partners and channels as possible in parallel to get a diversity of views. I partner with extension agents in the field. I partner with commodity organizations. You can see some of them listed here. I contact people on Facebook. I go on farm radio shows. I had this ad in West Coast Nut, which is the leading nut magazine for producers in the Central Valley. Basically, as many different channels as I can for getting a diversity of cultural backgrounds, politics, types of operations, types of landowners, to try to get at some more of those nuances happening in these communities. And I determine adequate sample size based on when I reach saturation, which means that with each additional interview, I'm hearing similar responses, and I'm not generating or hearing new ideas or relationships being uncovered. Altogether, this research is based on 114 in-depth semi-structured interviews, mostly with ranchers and farmers, also with local organizations, people from the solar industry. These are all case studies, and I use a modified grounded theory approach. So it's informed by the literature, but I use inductive thematic analysis on interview transcripts in a software program called In Vivo, which is basically a systematic way of identifying themes in the interview data, ideas that people are bringing up, and seeing how many people are bringing them up and are different types of landowners emphasizing different points so that I can look at internal differences. Now, when I have a team of researchers working with me, we always use intercoder reliability queries, which is a way of checking to make sure that different coders are interpreting the data similarly. Now, past research has already identified quite a few factors that influence how landowners make decisions. Things like their values, their perceptions, different forms of behavioral intent can determine whether a landowner adopts a practice or participates in a program. They also evaluate opportunities in light of the array of resources that they have available, their finances, whether they have family members available to implement the practice, this array of things that are taking place on any operation at any one moment. There can also be barriers to participation. So for example, things like the political legal system. Past studies have found that landowners, for instance, might have a strong preference for whether a program is hosted by a nonprofit versus a government agency, and that can determine their participation. At the same time, there can be enabling policies. So these are things that provide financial, technical support to the landowner to help them with the transition. Government programs, payment for ecosystem service markets, conservation group programs. If a landowner moves through this whole process, they decide to participate in a program or implement some action change, that results in ecological outcomes that then feed back into the system. And so these are the kinds of factors that I look at to understand what's happening at the farm or ranch level. And this is the framework that I use in each of my 3 case studies in conjunction with theories from other fields. Now, these are the motivating questions across my dissertation. When does it make sense for farmers and ranchers to implement specific interventions? What influences their decisions? What are the challenges and barriers? And what public and private policy solutions could enable adoption? My dissertation takes the form of 4 sections. The first is a literature review and then 3 case studies. Each are focused on a different environmental solution proposed for working lands. The first, I look at the use of managed grazing to increase soil carbon. And then The first case study is focused on how we can pay cattle ranchers for improvements, particularly in soil carbon, which is a form of payment for ecosystem service. The next case study investigates land use transitions on mountain meadows in the Sierra Nevada. And the third case study explores landowner perspectives on utility scale solar energy. I'll focus today mostly on the three case studies for the sake of time. And I just wanted to point out that each of these solutions or interventions, they lie at the intersection of climate change and conservation, because they have implications both for greenhouse gas emissions, soil carbon sequestration, but also things like wildlife habitat. I draw on data from several regions of California, from Sierra Valley, mountain meadows in the Sierra Nevada, the peri-urban rangelands of the San Francisco Bay Area, the San Joaquin Valley, both croplands and rangelands, and then some coastal Central Coast ranches in Central California. Before I dive into the case studies, I thought I might just highlight for you the findings of the literature review. This one was published by Lynn Huntsinger and I in Rangeland Ecology and Management, if you want to look more at the details. But as context, past studies had found that in some cases, intensive or rotationally managed cattle grazing can increase soil organic carbon. And soil carbon includes both organic carbon and inorganic carbon. In this case, if you were able to increase soil organic carbon, that could have benefits for mitigating climate change by drawing down carbon from the atmosphere, and also improving soil health. So in light of this opportunity, I was curious, what does this mean for California's rangelands? And in particular, I focused on California's annual rangelands, which is where most of the cattle are grazing in the state. It's dominated by annual plants. I drew on literature from several fields: social sciences, ecological sciences, like biogeochemistry, and also animal sciences, to try to understand the full picture of what this opportunity could mean for California. And what I found, kind of top line finding, was that using grazing management to increase soil carbon in this context on California annual rangelands is actually quite challenging. And that's because there's a host of factors that moderate the impact of grazing management on soil carbon. It really depends on the local precipitation, the local soil type, soil texture, and we have quite a bit of heterogeneity on California's rangeland, so it really depends on where you are. Alternatively, more promising and reliable solutions related to managing rangelands soil carbon do exist, and we highlight these in the piece. Preventing rangeland conversion, especially conversion of rangelands to high-intensity agriculture or to commercial and residential development, those have a pretty high carbon footprint. So preventing that trend, restoring marginal cropland, and restoring riparian areas should be the top things that the state is focused on having to do with carbon in the rangelands context. The other takeaway I wanted to highlight from this lit review is that livestock grazing in rangelands has impacts not just for food production and soil carbon, but other types of services that grazing provides. Managing biodiversity, there's quite a few species that are beneficially supported by cattle grazing in this context. Removing vegetation contributes to wildfire mitigation, obviously critical for California. It's also used for preventing the spread of invasive species. And given this array of potential benefits of grazing, it may be that single-purpose, carbon-focused management is just not appropriate to this context, because there's a lot of different benefits that we could be and should be managing for. That's all I'll say on that. I'll jump here now into the first case study, which in a way builds on that literature review. So the first case study is payments for ecosystem services within the hybrid governance model. And what that all means is, how do we pay cattle ranchers for improvements in ecosystem services? I want to highlight that I had a fantastic team on this project. Jace Hafner, who graduated, she was a joint MBA MS student, two incredible extension agents, Dr. Mashiri and Dr. Larson, as well as Eric and Lynn. But to take a step back, what is an ecosystem service? These are elements of nature that are used by humans to support human well-being. And you can see on the right an example of some of those things. So for example, global rangelands store a third of global soil carbon. That's a service provided to society. They host incredible biodiversity, and California's grasslands are world famous as biodiversity hotspots and hotspots for native species richness. skipping down a bit, human health and well-being is a very important service in these landscapes. For anyone who's ever gone hiking in the East Bay to see the wildflowers will be very familiar with this well-being aspect. And the biggest threat to this landscape today, or one of the biggest threats, is conversion to intensive uses or development. In fact, across the US, a third of our rangelands have already been converted. And this is an ongoing trend, particularly as the population pressure increases in the state. In this context, my research questions were, how do ranchers view payments for ecosystem services? So this is a payment is when for ecosystem service is when a landowner, a farmer, a rancher makes improvements in things like soil carbon or biodiversity, and so it gets paid for that additionality. Carbon offsets are an example of that. How are ranchers' goals aligned with the corporate goals and market structure of a new carbon market called ESMC? And is there complementarity between carbon markets and existing soil health programs? The focus of this piece was the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, or ESMC, very long name. It's the leading, largest agricultural carbon market in development today in the US. You can see some of the founding members listed here. And basically their model is that they want to be able to pay farmers and ranchers for increasing their soil carbon and being able to measure and demonstrate that increase using carbon offsets. This study draws on data from 2 different regions of California, the San Joaquin Valley, Central California, through interviews with ranchers in these regions. And we conducted thematic analysis on the interview transcripts to try to identify themes that our interviewees raised. We had 2 types of interviewees. The first was members of the ESMC, so these are corporations, NGOs building the carbon market. We asked them questions like, what motivates you to create this carbon market? What aspects do you find most concerning or challenging? And then for the ranchers, we asked them a whole lot of questions, but for example, what would be most important to you if you were to participate in a carbon market? Altogether, we conducted 24 interviews, 14 of which were with ranchers. So to put carbon offsets kind of into a broader view, there are different types of payments for ecosystem services. The first is price premiums. You might be familiar with, say, USDA Organic, where they can charge more for creating a product that's more sustainably raised. There's formal payment for ecosystem service markets. These are both regulatory or compliance driven, like California's cap and trade program, or voluntary, where corporations are volunteering to purchase, say, carbon offsets or biodiversity credits. And then you have government programs. These are largely run by the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service at the federal level, that can provide financial or technical assistance to farmers and ranchers to help them with that transition. We're focused here on voluntary markets because this is where carbon offsets sit. Now, in analyzing our interviews, we found that ESMC members and ranchers who might participate in the program have slightly different priorities. And you can see in parentheses the number of people who mentioned each theme. On the corporate side, they mostly were driven by the need to achieve quite ambitious sustainability commitments, climate commitments that these companies were making. And so they were looking to achieve supply chain sustainability. To do that, they had to establish rigorous scientific protocols for measuring soil carbon, reporting on it. They also needed to drive behavior change in their supply chains. They needed to convince the farmers and ranchers at the base of the supply chain to adopt new practices. As this ESMC member explained, there are a lot of barriers in the way of a farmer adopting different practices, but one of the significant ones is finances. We need to incentivize better finances. On the rancher side, they were most interested in protecting their properties for the long term, supporting the ecosystem services. They didn't use that term, but everything they described falls under that bucket. Protecting the soil health on their property, preserving the ranch from conversion. So as this rancher explained, keeping the ranch intact, building soil health, reducing erosion, increasing soil water holding capacity. That was their priority. Now, looking at these 2 areas of priorities, there is quite a bit of overlap around the theme of soil health. Now, soil carbon is one aspect of soil health. Soil health includes a lot of things like water infiltration and pH and microbial communities, but there's general agreement that improving soil health would be a win-win. Notwithstanding that shared agreement that we should improve soil health, what we found was that there's a lot of unmet demand for soil health conservation financing. And the way we looked at this was we pulled data from the USDA, NRCS, two leading programs that provide money for soil health type interventions, like using fencing to manage grazing in a way that prevents soil erosion. And looking at how many people were applying and how much money they were getting in this 1 year, 2019, we found a $135.7 million deficit, difference between the demand and the supply for this type of financing. And to us, this really emphasized the importance of private sector financing opportunities, what we call blended or hybrid financing for soil health, because there's a lot more demand for financing than what the government is currently able to provide. So in academia, we call this hybrid governance, where different sectors bring their resources, their talents, their abilities to ideally, positively manage a natural resource for long-term sustainability. And the ESMC sits between the corporations and civil society. So this carbon markets tool that they've developed has a few very important benefits that they're offering. The first is that they can improve resilience and productivity on cattle ranches, and that's by improving the soil health, which supports long-term yields and resilience and rangeland productivity. We also heard from ranchers that they'd like more data. They would like to be able to make decisions based on measurable data from year to year, rather than just looking to see if the grass is greener after they change practices. Carbon markets can provide that data. Finally, ranching is a notoriously low income and very volatile industry. And in light of that, income diversification is one of the most important things determining the success of cattle ranches. And so if carbon markets can provide that additional income, that can be an important income diversification opportunity for landowners. The risk of this approach is that it's outcomes-based. So ranchers will only get paid if they can demonstrate statistically significant increases in soil carbon. And reflecting on the first chapter, that might not happen depending on your context. So it puts all of the burden on the landowners up front without the assurance that they'll actually get paid for what they've invested in. For that reason, we highlight the importance of existing programs like those run by the NRCS, which mitigate some of that upfront risk by providing upfront financing, not for the outcomes, but for the practices being adopted in the first place. So the contributions of this chapter are that we developed a menu of payment for ecosystem opportunities for ranchers. This hadn't really existed, and I've been trying to share it back with the cattle ranching community since this study came out. We highlighted how carbon markets can provide soil health financing, support ranch resilience, improve data access. We also highlighted the important complementarity of existing federal government programs for mitigating upfront risk, especially during the transition period for producers. And we make some suggestions in the paper in Ecology and Society that how ESMC could address some of the current burdens, particularly things ranchers raise, like regulatory burdens, lack of transparency, things that keep them from wanting to participate in existing programs. So now moving on to my second case. This one is focused not on the variety of policies and how they all intersect, but the different types of landowners that we see on these landscapes and how different landowners might think about how to manage their properties and how to make decisions. This case is called The Drivers and Constraints of Land Use Transitions on Western Grasslands, and it's based on a case study in a California mountain ranching community in Sierra Valley. My research questions were, what land use transitions are taking place? How do different types of ranchers approach land use decisions? And what factors influence those decisions? Sierra Valley, for those who aren't familiar, is about 30-40 minutes north of Truckee, and it's a very large alpine meadow, basically covered now in privately owned cattle ranches. So I conducted all my interviews in that landscape, covering about half the valley's surface area or land area with my interviews. Altogether was 30 interviews with both ranchers and also local community and government organizations. I also wanted to understand better what land use transitions were happening from satellite data. And so I used data from the USDA Cropscape program, the Farmland Monitoring and Mapping program at the state level, and also a real estate database to understand some of the sales dynamics happening. I identified 3 major land use transitions taking place in Sierra Valley. The first was urban development. This is particularly true along the outskirts of the valley, where there have been some new home developments. As these locals explained, we have an influx of people in our community who are non-agriculture based. I've had interactions with people who are completely against our way of life. This is a rancher talking. I have noticed that the community culture has become much more of a bedroom community. While this trend is happening, based on the land cover data, only less than 1% of Sierra Valley has been converted to urban development. A much more significant transition I found is intensification of agriculture, and it's particularly for irrigated alfalfa hay production. I didn't realize how important alfalfa is to California, but it's the 2nd biggest crop after almonds in California by land area, so it's huge. It's an important income source for cattle ranchers. They sell to equestrians, to dairies. They also use it for their own operations. And increasingly, what I found was that the reason they're intensifying production in Sierra Valley is that they're losing access to grazing lands in other places. These ranchers practice transhumance, which means they move their cattle between seasonal pastures depending on the time of the year. And they've been losing access to grazing lands in the foothills, partly because of development, partly because of wildfire. Also, a lot of rangelands have been converted to almonds, intensive crops. So as these ranchers explain, it's cutthroat to find winter ground, that's winter grazing ground, because either it's going up in houses, or it's getting burnt, or it's in almonds. And because of that, as this rancher explained, we've developed a couple thousand acres of alfalfa, and we put irrigation on almost all of it. To show you what that looks like, in pink here is alfalfa in Sierra Valley. So this is the whole valley you can see in the lighter color. And between 2007 and 2018, I found a 67% increase in alfalfa hay production. One big problem with this is that alfalfa is a very thirsty crop. And because of overpumping for irrigating alfalfa, they have now documented land subsidence in the valley. So the ground is actually sinking in Sierra Valley. The third land use transition I identified is the opposite, disintensification, which means reduction of agricultural activities. This is the result of new types of landowners moving into the landscape who value the amenity values of their properties more than the production values. We call them amenity ranchers or hobbyist ranchers. They often work with nonprofit conservation groups to measure, say, bird habitat on their properties and make decisions based on those types of data. And these are often not primary residences. So it's a different type of landowner in this case. Now, some folks here might be familiar with conservation easements. This is a now growing popular tool used by conservation groups to try to prevent conversion of rangelands. It's essentially an agreement between the landowner and the conservation group that extinguishes the development rights, but the landowner gets to stay on the property, continues to own the land. They just can't develop the property in perpetuity. The first finding I had regarding these easements is that they're very appealing to the new types of landowners, these amenity landowners who are interested in the conservation values of their properties. And it's also appealing to folks who have water-constrained ranches because they couldn't convert to crop production anyway. They don't have enough water. So they might as well get paid for a conservation easement, and that helps protect their ranch's economic viability in the long term. There are many downsides to easements which keep quite a few ranchers from participating in them. And the first issue is that they can limit diversification. This is how ranchers explain their concerns. They are afraid that if they agree to a conservation easement, that would limit not only their own ability, but the generations to come if they wanted to plant a field or build a barn or do something to diversify their income that they wouldn't be able to because of the restrictions in these agreements. The second issue people identified is that they're already dealing with having trouble getting grazing lands, as we talked about previously. And in this case, some newer conservation easements also limit when they can start cattle grazing. They often say the rancher needs to wait until after the bird nesting season to graze to protect the birds. As this rancher explained, it always seems to end up being July 15th when your cattle can start grazing. Well, that's 2 months into your typical grazing season here. And maybe this is a little wonky, but to give you a sense of what that means, this is the protein content in the grasses of the mountain meadows of the west side Sierra Nevada. And you can see it's particularly rich in May and June. And so if you're not allowed to start grazing until July 15th because of the birds, then you've lost not only 2 months of grazing, but 2 months of really high protein, high quality grazing. In light of this, I think it's important that easements in the future be a little bit more flexible to landowners, that they bring landowners in earlier in the conversations, especially if they're developing restrictions that might impact their operations, and that could potentially increase participation in these kinds of programs. So the key contributions of this study, first I identify the land use transitions that are taking place on private mountain meadows based on the example of Sierra Valley. I uncovered some of the drivers and constraints on land use transitions, and I make recommendations in the final paper, which was just published in Landscape Ecology, on how we can upscale conservation easements by addressing producer concerns. And my reason for wanting to upscale these easements is that they have been found to be quite effective in preventing land conversion. Now to my third case study. Another pressure on rangelands, which folks may not have considered in the past, I hadn't considered it previous to this research, is large-scale solar arrays, what we call utility-scale solar. That's solar arrays that are a megawatt or more in size. So this chapter investigates that trend. It's called Landowner Decisions Regarding Utility-Scale Solar Energy on Working Lands. Just as a reminder, we have this goal in California to achieve 100% clean energy. To achieve that, we need 70 gigawatts of new additional solar, and that would require about 0.43 to 1.6 million acres of land to host those solar arrays. And this is considering both rooftop solar and utility scale solar. Like if we were to pursue both avenues, this is how much land we would need for the large scale solar arrays. According to previous models, about half of that target for solar development would require that working lands be converted to hosting solar. Given this, we were really surprised to see that not much research had been conducted into how agricultural landowners viewed this opportunity, what it would mean for farmers and ranchers who would have to decide to host this. So we had these research questions. What characteristics of landowners and operations are relevant to utility scale solar energy development? What benefits or drawbacks of solar do different types of landowners perceive? And under what conditions would they think solar as compatible with agriculture production? I had an amazing team. This was all during COVID that we worked together on this study. Ranjita, my co-lead, who's in the back of the room here, 4 undergraduate research assistants, as well as Eric and Lynn again on this study. So this was definitely a team effort. We conducted interviews in the peri-urban rangelands of the San Francisco Bay Area. We're actually surrounded by ranches. Many people aren't aware of this, but we have quite a bit of rangeland in this area. And then in the San Joaquin Valley, which is part of the Central Valley, we interviewed both crop farmers and cattle ranchers and sheep producers. To determine what types of interviews to try to target, we pulled the previous study called the Least Conflict Study that was done in the San Joaquin Valley. They had identified where solar should go to avoid impacting valuable habitat and other types of lands that we really shouldn't be putting solar on. We took that GIS file in QGIS and we intersected it with a land cover data set from the USDA about what types of crops are being grown there. And what we found was that almonds, winter wheat, pistachios, these crops listed here were the kind of key types of farms that would be impacted by solar in the previous modeling studies. So that's where we focused our outreach for this case. Again, we conducted thematic analysis on interview transcripts, and we tried to pull out the themes that came out in response to these questions. We had many questions again, but these are just to give you a sense. How would you characterize your interest in hosting solar on your property? How much of your property would you dedicate to solar? And then for the solar developers we interviewed, we asked them what types of landowners they work with, what types of contracts they use, how much do landowners make with solar, and what are the constraints on solar development. We conducted altogether 60 interviews, including 40 with farmers and ranchers. And we drew on not only agricultural decision-making theory in our analysis, but also land rent theory from classical economics. We found quite a variety of interest amongst landowners in hosting solar. So some people were very much against it, some were totally pro it or had already done it, some in the middle, kind of neutral or considering. Now, who would be most interested in hosting solar or was already hosting solar? We found 3 categories of operations. The first was water-constrained farms. So in the San Joaquin Valley, in particular, they've been quite impacted by the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. That's forcing them to reduce how much water they use, and so quite a bit of land is being fallowed because of that policy. And so these water-constrained lands suddenly become very attractive for solar because the landowners are looking for new opportunities to make money since they can no longer grow almonds or whatever they were growing before. The second category is farms with high energy costs. They have growing energy bills that they're really concerned about, and solar can help offset some of those costs. These tend to be processors like tomato and onion processors, juice processors. Dairies have high energy bills for cooling livestock. Also, those that use drip irrigation or groundwater pumping, they all have high energy bills. And then the final category is low-income operations, so especially cattle ranches that are looking for a way to stabilize their otherwise pretty volatile and risky business. Through our interviews, we identified several factors that were influencing people's decision about whether to host solar. The first, maybe not so surprising, is profit maximization. How much would I make with solar? How much would I make with almonds or whatever I'm currently growing, and choose the one that makes you more. Water access is really important. Past models have estimated that because of SGMA, up to 500,000 acres of land may be fallowed in this region, in the San Joaquin Valley. And so I highlight in particular here the Westlands Water District. This is the west side of Fresno County, where they've been particularly hard hit by water constraints, and it's been identified by previous studies as being ideal for solar development. We also heard that financing plays an important role for landowners, subsidies, cost relief programs. As this farmer explained, I probably would be less inclined to put solar in if there wasn't that tax incentive. These are for people who are building their own arrays. That's one model. Finally, we found that landscape values actually play a pretty significant role in landowners' decision-making process, and they come in 3 forms. For many farmers and ranchers, they thought the top priority for this landscape should be growing food. That's what it's for. And therefore, we don't need to be producing energy. That can be done elsewhere, not on the most rich soils in the country, they would say. Secondly, if a solar array would interfere with your view on your property, especially if you're an amenity rancher, then that might prevent you from wanting to host solar. Finally, quite a few people had concerns about the environmental impacts of arrays on their properties. Say, for instance, if you're a rancher and you have burrowing owl habitat, you might really not want to put anything close to where that habitat is. And in fact, solar arrays are quite high impact, we found. As the solar developer explained, we're basically sterilizing the environment underneath the solar panels to keep the operation and maintenance costs at a reasonable level. It's quite interesting if you compare between how farmers think about these things and how ranchers think about these things. We found that crop producers, or farmers, they emphasize much more the profit opportunity of solar when evaluating this opportunity. Whereas livestock producers, or cattle ranchers, they talked much more frequently about potential environmental impact, the viewshed impact of solar factoring into their decisions. Another way to look at that is the radar chart on your right. The green diamond is ranchers, the orange diamond is farmers, and you can see that ranchers have a much more balanced approach to thinking about the different factors in making the decision. And I just wanted to point out that San Joaquin Valley ranchers were more interested in hosting solar than Bay Area ranchers. And Bay Area ranchers were bringing up these ideas of environmental and viewshed impacts more frequently. So based on all these findings, our team presented some recommendations to the California Energy Commission in a presentation last month. Just an excerpt of the recommendations. For instance, we suggested that future transmission and distribution planning at the state level target these areas where there'll be quite a bit of retired cropland, and also areas with a high number of operations that have high energy bills, because solar can be particularly important to those types of operations. Given the importance of water that we uncovered, we suggested that any new spatial optimization GIS-based modeling studies should account for groundwater and surface water availability, not just today, but also in the future under climate change, under different policies, because that should influence where solar can be developed. And then finally, we heard from most landowners that they would, if they were to host solar, they dedicate maybe up to 5 to 10% of their properties to solar. They wouldn't convert the whole thing because they were primarily a farmer or a rancher by occupation. Given that, we thought it would be important to aggregate neighboring smaller properties to achieve the scale that's needed for a utility scale solar array. So the key contributions of this study: different types of landowners appear to have very different perspectives, whether it's a farmer, a rancher, or different types of farms. The landscape values that a landowner has can decrease their interest in solar. And we also developed recommendations for transmission and distribution development at the state level. So looking back across all this work, basically I've highlighted that there's environmental outcomes that we're interested in. The state has set very ambitious goals for achieving those outcomes. We can create policies, programs like carbon markets, and they require certain actions on the ground by either farmers or ranchers to implement them. But I hope that we can remember that at the center of all of these things is the landowner, is either the farmer or the rancher. And I hope that in the future we can focus more on what's influencing their decisions. So I've highlighted that conservation priorities and climate priorities can be win-win, but there can also be tensions that need to be evaluated. These policies often put upfront risk and burden on the producers themselves, and we have to remember that and try to relieve some of those financial burdens. There can be different scales of impact. So thinking back to Sierra Valley, somebody losing grazing lands access in the foothills because of land conversion for wine or almond development, that could impact how they intensify land in a faraway place in a mountain meadow community. Different types of landowners, whether they're farmers or ranchers, make a difference for whether they'll implement a program. And finally, water in every single case appeared to be one of the leading factors influencing land use change on California working lands and needs to be accounted for in any types of policies, whether they're carbon focused or biodiversity focused or otherwise. Even though these studies were drawn from California, I think that there's implications from this research for other landscapes, especially those experiencing water constraints and land fallowing, those grazing livestock, those experiencing transitions in ownership, say to amenity ownership, and those experiencing renewable energy development. So a lot of places in the EU and Australia are experiencing similar trends, and I think this research can inform further research in those areas as well as policy development. And I'll just leave you with two things to mull over, or broader implications of the work. The first is that working lands support a variety of services to broader society, storing carbon, supporting biodiversity. And we often focus on one outcome in creating policy. But I'd like to suggest a broader view of managing these landscapes that's multi-purpose or holistic in its approach. So we can broaden the variables, for instance, that we're measuring and that we're incentivizing through our conservation and climate programs. The second thing is that the individuals and families on these landscapes are the linchpins for the success of our environmental policies. And when I say policies, I mean also private sector programs. And so addressing these people's concerns is going to be critical for upscaling any environmental solutions. Bringing them to the table early, making sure that their concerns are addressed, and importantly, framing the policy in terms of the priorities of the landowner rather than the priorities of the person or the program developers. So for instance, a climate policy might not be attractive to a landowner, but a soil health policy, which is looking to achieve the same things, would be. So framing those things, those programs in terms of what the landowner actually cares about, I think could attract a lot more participants. I hope that future research will help to address some of these opportunities, and I plan to continue to contribute to these areas of work as well. How can we minimize environmental trade-offs between climate solutions and conservation solutions? How can we integrate grazing into solar arrays? I didn't mention this, but in the solar study, we do talk about potential co-location of solar and both crop farming and cattle ranching or sheep producing, some of the benefits and challenges there. How can we mitigate upfront risk that's placed on producers? And how can we better engage amenity landowners in things like providing grazing lands access to traditional ranchers or restoring grassland? With that, I hope I've left you with a better sense of how some of these environmental policies can be scaled over time and how we can better center the landowners in this discussion, particularly the farmers and ranchers that are managing these landscapes. And I look forward to your questions.
Okay, we're going to extend a little bit because I'm sure you have more than 3 minutes worth of questions. And so I want to give a chance for people in the room and people online to ask questions. I have a couple of questions pending online, but are there questions in the room? Want to think about that? And I'll start with the questions online. I brought my reading glasses. Okay, so I'm going to lump two questions because I think they're related. One from Billy Freeman of the Sierra Foothill Conservancy. What strategies can land trusts use to address producer concerns regarding conservation easements? Okay, and from Larry Ford, in case number 2, under conservation easements, can we expect amenity ranchers to eventually be replaced by non-rancher amenity owners with no grazing? Without specific provisions in the conservation easement to assure continued grazing, that result would impact the grazing-dependent regional livestock community, biodiversity conservation, fire hazard reduction, et cetera.
That's a lot.
It was a lot, sorry.
I love both those questions. I think on the conservation easements and increasing their success, I mentioned this, I think it's really important that we anticipate concerns. There's a lot of suspicion about what environmental groups, what conservation groups are trying to do to the landscape, or are they trying to buy it all up and convert it to a rewilded, Jurassic Park? There's a lot that we can get out ahead of by engaging communities, creating group discussions, working with local resource conservation districts to address some of the concerns. And I think that is the key to upscaling conservation easements. It's been really challenging. The Nature Conservancy and others have done a lot of work in Sierra Valley and other regions to try to get as many people as possible to sign on to conservation easements, and there's been some pushback from the local communities. One of the challenges is that it's hard to get financing for conservation easements that don't have a lot of restrictions. So some of it has to do with the funder saying, it's really important to us that we have bird habitat, and you build all these restrictions into the easement, but then it may be that it makes the easement not even feasible and no longer a useful tool. So I think there needs to be an ongoing conversation between funders and the conservation groups and the landowners to try to establish what's actually possible and what avoids putting these operations at risk. Because if they're not financially viable in the long term, then it's a non-starter. The second question was too complicated. Okay. Larry, I'll follow up with you.
Okay. All right, questions in the room? Yes.
Yeah, Nick, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. A quick question for you. So we've talked a lot about soil health, and obviously that's a big umbrella term for a variety of ecosystem services that soils provide. So I'm curious, did ranchers identify any specific sort of like facet or type of soil health that they were interested in?
Yes.
Can you sort of repeat the question as you answer, because I'm not sure that it's picked up.
Oh, sure. The question is, which of the various variables that together make up soil health are ranchers most interested in the interviews? Ranchers most often talked about preventing soil erosion and improving water infiltration. So those are the two aspects. They were interested in carbon to the extent that they could be paid for increasing it, but carbon on its own wasn't that interesting for them. They want also to promote forage productivity, right? Because they need that, they depend on that. So if they can invest in these soil health aspects and improve yields over time, that was exciting for them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, I have an unnamed person online.
Uh-oh.
Who wants to know if you found anything on the monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements of carbon markets that there was a barrier to participation.
So monitoring, reporting, and verification, what we call MRV, is the biggest challenge of agricultural carbon markets today. basically you can have super rigorous, super expensive, go out and, Emily goes out in the field and collects some soil and she takes it back to the lab and does her whole thing, and then you blow your whole budget as a carbon market in doing that. On the other hand, you can use remote sensing data and create some models that can predict the soil carbon on rangelands or on farmlands, but that's also not quite as accurate. Those models, especially in the rangeland context, often don't reflect actual soil carbon levels. So these carbon markets today are trying to figure out where in the center of these things can they combine some amount of soil sampling, maybe not every year or every month, and some amount of remote sensing to give the public a sense of rigor and trust that the carbon offsets are real without making them so expensive or onerous to the landowner that they just wouldn't be scalable.
A question in the room? Yes,
Thank you so much. Great. I was wondering, were the interviews done one time, or did you have any follow-up interviews? I'm just wondering about, the context of where people might be at any time in answering those are the questions.
Yeah.
You're talked a lot about at the local level, but maybe what's going on with them at the larger societal level.
I did do some repeat interviews, and that was because of COVID. We were particularly curious if factors that we were seeing in the data had to do not with differences in the people we were interviewing, whether a farmer or rancher, but in them being pre-COVID versus post-COVID, right? And the pandemic had all kinds of effects on the agricultural community. So for people who I'd interviewed in Sierra Valley previous to the pandemic, in person or by phone, they all received follow-up phone calls where I tried to tease out some of those things. And I didn't find a big impact of COVID on their responses to things like, what is your long-term vision for the property, or talking about different wildlife species, or those kinds of things didn't seem to have differed any from before and during the pandemic.
Okay, I've got one more question online, and then I'll take one more from in the room, if there is one, and then we'll go to wrap up. You did not mention land tenure to be a characteristic in any of the three cases. Were all farmers and ranchers you interviewed land secure?
There was one landowner I interviewed in one of the cases who had just lost access to the ranch. And this is, in general, an issue with this work from a environmental justice, diversity, equity, inclusion type perspective, is that I'm focusing on people who own land. And so there's inherently a bias there. There's also, this is very much a white male industry, ranching in particular is more than farming, but both are that way. And so my samples reflected that. And I didn't, because of that, capture the perspective of a lot of landowners who either didn't own land, where some of them were leasing grazing land and kind of putting together different parcels to create their forage base, but those weren't the majority. And I think that's an important question, is like, how can minorities, people who don't traditionally own land, how can they become part of this industry, become part of this solution, and actually access grazing lands? I think that amenity landowners could be an interesting solution here, because you have a lot of people who need vegetation management on their amenity ranches, and they could provide lands at lower rates to these types of ranchers who are trying to break into the industry, or for sheep producers too.
The last question in the room. Okay. So, yes, Lynn.
You're definitely allowed to ask questions.
Restate Larry's question a little bit, kind of mixed.
Oh, thank you.
Things that Sherry's done, which is that a lot of times these easements, and I don't know how true this is in Sierra Valley, but in annual grasslands certainly, are given under the premise that the ranch will continue and that grazing will continue to provide services that are very important, in particular to some endangered species and to vegetation management. It's related to what you just said. However, the easement provisions do little to maintain the viability, or to contribute to maintaining the viability of the ranch. And I think Larry's concern was, as you get more amenity owners, will some of them buy these ranches, and then the grazing will disappear, and then a lot of the benefits of the easement will too. Do you think that's a concern, and did you see concern about that?
I saw concern about that. I do think it's a concern that people we're not going to get rid of grazing. because you have to manage the vegetation, and removing grazing would be a disaster from a biodiversity perspective. But what people could do is say, I don't want cattle, I want pronghorn antelope and bison, and I want to rewild some Pleistocene ungulates that are, there's a community of people who are trying to do that kind of rewilding. So I think there is some risk of that. And the problem with easements is that they don't create ecological outcomes as goals. They don't say, we want to improve this species of butterfly by X%, and let the landowner come up with how to do that. They just say, you can't subdivide the land, you can't build on it. And so it's a pretty rigid tool for that reason. I would love to see more programs, and I guess this gets more into payments for ecosystem services, where we just set these goals for landowners and let them be creative in how they can manage a viable business, but also support bird habitat and improve water quality. And they're very creative. These ranchers, they're most familiar with the landscape. So I'd rather that be maybe not built into conservation easements, because that's just adding more layers of bureaucracy, but kind of pairing opportunities where you can have an easement, but also plug into a payment for ecosystem service program.
Opportunity for hybrid.
Yes,
Strategy.
bundled ecosystem services.
All right. So back to you for closing remarks.
I have a lot of people to thank. We were just talking, if I go too long, cue the orchestra. First of all, I'm just incredibly lucky to have been able to work with Eric and Lynn as my lead advisors at Stanford, at Berkeley. They were so just kind and thoughtful and willing to hear out crazy ideas and help me think through methods and be creative in my approach. I can't thank you both enough for that, for playing that role for me. I also have had a very engaged reading committee. I don't know if anyone else's committees are like this, but Bruce, I've worked with since day one on my research. He's helped me to think through ideas, helped me raise funding for rangelands research, kindly suggested that perhaps I could use some undergrad research assistants and maybe a few more. Gabrielle, I've worked so closely with you on qualitative research. You always made me feel really welcomed in your lab. I think it's totally changed the environment here at Stanford, having you here and getting to have you on my committee has just been, I feel very lucky. Jim, being able to talk to you about professional things as well as academic, and you also chaired my quals. So since then, you've been a part of this process. I'm just very grateful to have this group working with me. Most of this research I did with other people, and so I have to thank a lot of folks. On the ESMC Payment for Ecosystem Service study, I co-led the study with Jace Hafner, who took our findings and went off and made a startup because she's was a business school student. And now they have 10,000 farmers who are getting access to new types of financing through FarmRaise. It's amazing. Dr. Mashiri, Dr. Larson were critical for our outreach in their communities. Our solar team, Ranjita, Kavya, Steffi, Devin, Hannah, they were not only colleagues, but also friends during COVID. We met every week and were just like rays of light for each other. Sheila Berry, thank you for your help wherever you are, if you're on Zoom, in outreach and thinking through research questions, and to all the partner organizations that helped us with outreach in the San Joaquin Valley and in this area as well. Most graduate programs, I think, don't have a dedicated staff of people helping you along the way, and we have these wizards of E-IPER that just make everything happen and make it really easy for us as students to focus on research and get things done. So I wanted to thank Gabby and Anne-Marie and I and Miley and Anjana and Sue. They're all here. Thank you for everything you've done over the last years to help me along the way. I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Michael Wara and Jenna Davis. In my first year, I took classes with both of them with my cohort. They taught me about epistemology, policy windows, all kinds of great stuff I'd never heard of before, how to form research questions and methods. I have a wonderful cohort, some of whom are here today. And I just am very appreciative of your humor and kindness and your willingness to always throw ideas off of each other, just being very present throughout my journey. Buzz Thompson, I crossed paths with him on a cattle ranch, and he's the one who suggested that perhaps I should come to Stanford and do a PhD. He's very mischievous. And so I have to thank him for that. I want to thank the Stanford Land Change Lab and the Bill Lane Center, as well as the Berkeley Range Lab. They've been my homes during my graduate studies, and I very much value all the colleagues in those communities. I couldn't have done any of this without my family. My sister Danny's here. Tris took a lot of the photos my brother-in-law took a lot of the photos in this deck. They've always been there for me through thick and thin and let me move in at random times. My parents who are on Zoom, my husband's in the back. Thank you for all of your patience, for believing I could do a PhD too, for agreeing to get married on a cattle ranch. To David's family, Joan is here, my mother-in-law from Nebraska, all the siblings. I just am blown away that you're all here. It means so much to me. I dedicate my written dissertation to my maternal grandmother and grandfather, Riva and Alexander. I hope Riva's on the Zoom. I put it on her iPad yesterday. None of this work would have been possible without amazing sponsors who supported this over the array of, the incredible number of things they could support. The Ann and Reed Buckley Fund, which is not me, Buckley. The Emmett Family Collaboration Grant Fund, the Bill Lane Center, the McGee Research Grant, the E-IPER Summer Research Grant, the Haas Center Schneider Fellowship, Stanford Earth Dean Fellowship, and the Stanford Sustainability Initiative, with which Bruce worked with me to secure a grant from. Finally, and most importantly, thank you to all the ranchers and farmers who generously share their time, their life stories, their perspectives with our team. I hope that these research findings will contribute positively to the long-term resilience and success of your communities.